It was a rainy night in New York City, the kind where the streets glistened with the reflection of neon lights from nearby billboards and the occasional car passing by. The sky seemed heavy with clouds that hung low, matching the somber atmosphere inside the penthouse of Luca DeMarco, the heir to one of the most powerful mafia families in the world. Isabella Cole stood by the large glass windows, her gaze wandering across the vast cityscape. She had always felt out of place in the world of wealth and power. Raised in a gilded cage by her father, a politician who had buried himself in corruption, Isabella had never fully embraced the lifestyle she was born into. But it had all changed the day her father's enemies came for him, and by extension, for her. They weren't just after his reputation, but his daughter too. Luca had been the one to collect. From the moment she met him, Isabella knew he wasn't like the other men who frequented her father's political circles. He was more dangerous. A predator lurking behind cold eyes and a charming smile. His reputation preceded him, but nothing could have prepared her for how consuming and controlling he could be. What began as a business arrangement quickly morphed into something far more complicated, something neither of them could ignore. Luca stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space with his magnetic presence. His sharp, calculating eyes met hers, unreadable as always. But tonight there was something different, something darker. He had become accustomed to the tension between them, but lately it was growing. The moments of shared silence, the way his gaze lingered just a bit too long when their paths crossed in the mansion. "Isabella," he said softly, but there was an undeniable edge to his voice. "Come here." She hesitated. The last time she had walked to him on command, it had led to a night of passion that had both terrified and awakened something within her. A part of her still wanted to resist him, to fight the force that seemed to pull them together. But her body betrayed her, her feet moving toward him before she could think twice. Luca reached out, his strong hand grasping hers as she stood before him. He didn't say anything, but his fingers tightened around hers in a gesture that spoke volumes. His eyes flicked to the city below, then back to her, and for the first time, she saw something different in them, something raw. "You don't belong in this world, Isabella," Luca murmured. "You belong with me." She pulled her hand away, but he was quick, stepping closer until there was barely any space between them. "You don't get to decide that," he whispered, his voice low and threatening. She swallowed hard, the fear creeping up her spine. "I don't belong to anyone, Luca." Luca's lips curved into a dangerous smile. "You will, eventually. You don't have a choice." Days passed and Isabella could feel the tension building. She had no choice but to play along, caught in a web of debts and promises, and Luca was the spider who controlled it all. But there were moments, fleeting moments, when he didn't seem like the ruthless mafia boss. When he looked at her, she saw something human behind the facade. It was confusing, to say the least, because every time she thought she had him figured out, he threw her off balance again. One evening, she sat at the edge of his luxurious dining table, her fingers tracing the rim of a glass of wine as Luca spoke to his associates in rapid Italian. The men around the table were used to Luca's intimidating presence, but tonight there was a different energy in the room. He was restless, his words clipped as he outlined the details of an upcoming deal with a rival family. As Luca's gaze swept across the room, it landed on Isabella. She caught the subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of something, almost like concern, before he masked it with his usual cool demeanor. When the meeting broke, Luca's bodyguards flanked him as they left the room. Isabella stood unsure of what to do with herself in the quiet aftermath of the tense conversation. The weight of Luca's attention never seemed to ease, even when he wasn't looking at her directly. "Isabella," Luca's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. "Meet me in the office." She nodded, the familiar anxiety returning as she followed him down the long corridor toward his private office. The dim lighting and sleek modern furnishings did little to ease her unease. Luca was always at his most intimidating in this space, his sanctuary, where he made decisions that shaped empires and destroyed lives. And yet somehow he had allowed her into it, into his world. When she entered the office, he was already at his desk, sorting through papers. He looked up as she walked in, and his expression softened for a fraction of a second. So brief, she almost missed it. "What's going on, Luca?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. What is all of this? He motioned for her to sit across from him, his dark eyes never leaving hers. It's business, Isabella. Something that you don't need to worry about. I can't just sit here and pretend everything's fine when you're constantly looking over your shoulder, she said, her voice rising. You don't have to do this, Luca. You don't have to be this person. Luca's jaw tightened and he leaned forward, the intensity of his stare making her heart race. I have no choice, Isabella. This life doesn't give you choices. You think I want to be the monster everyone makes me out to be? You think I enjoy this? Number. But I will do whatever it takes to protect what's mine. The words hung in the air, the heaviness of them sinking into her chest. She opened her mouth to argue, but something stopped her. His pain, his vulnerability, the crack in his icy armor that she'd glimpsed for only a second. Before she could respond, the door slammed open, and one of Luca's men rushed in. Boss, the man said urgently, there's a situation. We need to move now. Luca stood, his eyes flicking to Isabella, before he walked toward the door. Stay here. Don't move, he ordered, his voice hard, no longer the man who had shown her a glimmer of tenderness. Isabella stayed behind, the weight of his command settling on her shoulders. But as the door clicked shut, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She wasn't safe in this world. Not anymore. Hours passed. The silence in the penthouse was almost unbearable. Isabella wandered from room to room, her thoughts consumed by Luca's words. He had promised her safety, but there was so much danger swirling around them. And what if it was all just a manipulation? Then the door opened. Luca stood in the doorway, his face streaked with blood. His suit was torn, his hair disheveled, but his eyes, those cold, merciless eyes, were locked on her with a force that sent a chill down her spine. You didn't have to see that, he said, his voice raw. But I couldn't let them come after you. Isabella's heart skipped a beat as she looked at him. Luca, you... Before she could finish, Luca was in front of her, his hand cupping her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek, where a tear had fallen. I told you, no one hurts you, not while I'm still breathing. His lips were on hers before she could protest, but this time, there was no anger, no manipulation. It was raw and desperate, a kiss that felt like both a promise and a warning. But even in that moment of tenderness, Isabella knew. Luca DeMarco was a man who would never be hers. Not entirely. He was a man shaped by violence and betrayal, and his love, or whatever it was, came with a price. And as he pulled away, his lips curling into that dangerous smile of his, she knew that this was a world she could never leave. She was already too deep.